Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest in the Veramed webinar series. Today we've got Diana Stuart, Programming Manager, talking to you on the generation game, the X, Y and Z of line managing clinical data scientists. So if you haven't heard from Diana before, she has been in programming in SAS since 1996, moving from banking to the pharmaceutical industry in 1998. Her experience includes 10 years as an independent contractor and involved working for a number of pharmaceutical companies with a significant global presence. Diana's roles have allowed exposure to multiple therapeutic areas and clinical trial phases from phase 1 through to phase 4. She has significant experience in early development and phase 1 to 3 oncology, as well as the production and management of IDMC packages. Since 2009, Diana has been an active member of Pharmaceutical Users Software Exchange, Fuse, and presenting at their annual conference almost every year with an emphasis on professional development. She's also held the role of Fuse newsletter editor for over 8 years. So if you haven't joined a Veramed webinar before, and just a few housekeeping rules, you'll probably notice that you're automatically on mute. So if you've got any questions throughout the session, you can type them into your questions box, which you'll find on the toolbar on the right-hand side, and I will present those to Diana at the end of the session. If you've got any technical issues as well, if you just pop your question into the question box, I'll be able to respond to you throughout as well. The slides and a recording of the webinar will also be available to you after the webinar. We will be uploading the recording onto the Veramed YouTube channel, and we'll be sending a link out via email to you for that too. So without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Diana. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Louise. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. Over the next sort of 25 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about line managing different generations of clinical data scientists. Like many line managers, I line manage people across more than one generation, and recently I became very interested in looking at the different generations to try and understand whether there is anything more that I should be doing as a line manager. So this story started a couple of years ago when I was at a social gathering, and I was catching up with a friend of mine who also works in quite a technical industry, and we were talking about work, and I was telling him about how excited I was about having our 6 new graduate starters, and in turn he told me how fed up his boss was with graduates. In fact, his boss was so fed up that he had decided that he was no longer going to recruit millennials. Now, I actually find this quite a shocking state of affairs, and I immediately thought how incredibly discriminatory this was, but also it was kind of a sort of drastic and short-sighted action. And really, the idea of ruling out recruiting from an entire generation just didn't seem to be the best business practice. So I started to ask my friend a few more questions. I wanted to find out what was going on. Now, commenting on the youth of today really is nothing new. You've probably seen this quote in some form or other as it pops up on social media quite frequently, and it dates back to ancient times. So a couple of friends of mine are well rehearsed in commenting on the youth of today. They run they run businesses in fairly manual areas, and they employ quite a lot of youngsters, and they frequently moan about the youth. But going back to my story, in this case, my friend was in a technical area as a solutions architect. So whilst not the same, it's quite a technical role, and certainly in the same arena as clinical programming. And I really wanted to know more. So I set off on this path to find out more about the different generations. And through my research, I came to realise that the newest generations to join the workforce, they had gained this less than complimentary reputation, and I wasn't entirely convinced that it was deserved. As a line manager, it felt important to me to find out more about this labelling of generations and understand its influence on people management, specifically the management of clinical data scientists. And I wanted to answer the question, should line managers adapt their approach depending on the generation of the individual? So the study of generation is not particularly a new idea. Back in the 1920s, Karl Mannheim discussed the issue in an essay, and since then, probably the most well-known publication was the 1991 book Generations, which focused on a recurring generational cycle in American history. And one of the main issues with these studies of generations is that for us that are working in a global environment, it's a very Western-centric theory, and it seems to lack a broader cultural understanding. And this, for me, was really a problem. It is perhaps logical to accept that people are influenced by events in their formative years, as is discussed in these theories. But even within one country, these influences can vary wildly. So, for example, growing up in the UK during the 1980s would have been a very different experience in the southeast of England, where there was low unemployment and the service industries were booming, than, say, in areas such as the north of England, Wales, Scotland, where there was higher unemployment and large-scale deindustrialisation. So this really was an issue in my mind. There is also the issue that these generation experts didn't seem to be able to decide on a date definition of the different generations. So you can see here in this infographic, I've kind of squished some data together. I've got some various sources, and you can see that the generations overlap. So I'm going to go through some of these labels that are being applied to the generations, but just to give you a flavour of the type of labels that are being applied to each generation. But just bear in mind that there really is a UK influence here. So first up, we have the baby boomers. This is the post-World War II generation. They grew up in a time of economic upturn and with a culture of positivity. And as the name alludes to, it was a time of a higher birth rate following the war. The result of which, initially anyway, was that there were overcrowded schools and increased competition in the workplace. They are the generation, that was the first generation to do better financially than their parents, and they really weren't afraid to spend it. Hence, they got this Generation Me label. And as a generation, they were more likely to be open to new ideas and change, to be less conformist than their parents. This was a generation that could include someone who'd lived through their hippie times as a teenager and then was doing well as a yuppie in the city as a 20-something. So they resonate primarily with loyalty and a work ethic, steady career path, and compensation. And just to give you a kind of milestone of where the technology was, this was the generation that grew up with television. The next generation was Generation X. This was a generation that grew up at a time when birth rates were actually declining and their parents were supervising them much less, particularly as we entered a time where there was increasing divorce rates and it became much more usual for both parents to work. So they kind of had this label of latchkey generation. This really contributed to the generation becoming more independent. Technology was advancing. The sort of milestone here was really that computers were developing, and this generation was really embracing technology. Generation X has been credited with being more entrepreneurial, developing the concept of work-life balance. And in addition, they have a focus on individual advancement, stability, and job satisfaction. Next, we have Generation Y, also known as millennials. So this generation was born in a period of, once again, the increasing birth rates. They grew up in a time that included the rapid growth of the internet. So really, you know, they had a lot of social media going on as they grew up. They tended to be more global centric, really, as a result of having this access to the internet. unfortunately, they've attracted rather negative labels of narcissism and having a sense of entitlement. And these seem, these may be due to the fact that there were a real change in parenting styles going on. You may have heard that term of helicopter parenting. They grew up in a time of consumer abundance, and it's been very easy to get credit as well during this time. And in the UK, this is the generation that is the most educated generation of workers. So in addition to placing importance on work-life balance, they like producing meaningful work, finding a creative outlet, and they have a preference for immediate feedback for their work. And then lastly, we have Generation Z. You may also hear these be referred to as the I generation or post-millennials, plurals. And this is the generation that has grown up online. They are very comfortable with technology and much more used to interacting on social media. And they've grown up at a time which is far more enlightened and accepting than previous generations. Possibly because of that, we're beginning to see things like falling teenage pregnancy rates in this generation, and they're much less likely to drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes. So whilst it's unlikely that any of these are in our teams yet, I've mentioned them because this generation will be joining us in the next 5 years. And Generation Z have really lived their childhood years through quite a different environment compared to their millennial predecessors. Okay. So there is a problem with labelling generations, but it's something that as humans we're quite drawn to doing. Humans have a natural tendency to group things together and add labels. It really is in our nature, and it's quite hard to resist. But for those of us that work in statistics, this is kind of an interesting problem to have, because we know when we're analysing data how much persuasion we need from the analysis to draw a proper conclusion. There really has to be sufficient evidence to prove the hypothesis. Yet we are still quite happy to make sweeping statements about people based on very few negative experiences. And you could argue essentially this is what's happened with the millennials, and with a big help from social media, of course, as well. But managers everywhere are looking to increase their understanding of the workforce, and grouping people together and tagging them can seem like a really appealing idea. The problem is that people are just not that simple. And in the case of the study of generations in general, conclusions have been drawn that are not supported by the data. And as I just mentioned, as people in this industry, we really like the data to support the hypothesis. My own experience is that these generational labels are not accurate. I'm sure lots of you know people who are not millennials who overshare on Facebook or like to binge watch box sets. These labels aren't helpful for many reasons, but really for those of us in pursuit of forming cohesive teams, applying something to individuals that seeks to divide the team seems to be counterproductive. And another reason that these labels are not helpful is that they're being applied to the working population as a whole, not the population that we're actually interested in, which is clinical data scientists. Individuals that look to work in this area of clinical data science, in our case, specifically in statistics and statistical programming, they tend to have characteristics that are suited to the work. And my personal experience of recruiting millennials in this area is that I am seeing people that have a natural curiosity, they drive to problem solve, and thirst for knowledge is far more prevalent than maybe some of the more negative labels like laziness that is predicted by the generational label. Now I have a picture of a book here, which is something I recommend if you wanted to read something more about the problem with labeling generations. And the author concludes in this book is that we must avoid the natural human tendency to categorize, label, and stereotype individuals based on their age or generation. Instead, we must do the less sexy work of understanding the individuals in front of us, their motives, tendencies, personality quirks, and preferences. Anything else in the workplace is simply discrimination. So going back to my friend's problem, I really got to thinking about really what his boss has experienced, and maybe, you know, what he had been thinking that led him to such an extreme reaction. And I thought that maybe I should try and put myself in his shoes. And I came up with some questions, and we know that line managers do face challenges from their younger line reports. But I decided that if we want to mitigate these sort of unsatisfactory interactions, then it actually may be necessary to ask ourselves some difficult questions. And I came up with 4 questions that I thought we should be asking ourselves. So I'm just going to go through them here. So the first one is, are you afraid of your younger line reports? Now, as each year passes, we interview seemingly smarter, brighter, shinier graduate candidates. They have better qualifications than us. They're accompanied by a string of astonishing extracurricular achievements. But maybe, you know, we are a little afraid of our line reports because of these reasons, and we do need to remind ourselves how important our industry experiences, including the wider world of drug development outside of clinical data science, and our life experiences, and how much that brings to our ability to line manage and project manage and be technically able. So this may come back to our own self-confidence issues. So the other question I came up with was, are you concerned that your line reports know more than you? Now, new graduates may well give that impression, and, you know, to be honest, maybe they do know more than us. But this really presents an opportunity for knowledge sharing in the workplace and possible innovation with respect to maybe statistical and programming practices. It is important for both line managers and line reports to really appreciate the need for both theoretical learning and the experience and how they fit together. So the next question is, are you envious of your line reports? You know, there may be many reasons why we're envious of our line reports, and I certainly can give you an example of something that I've noticed, that, you know, millennials are also known as Generation Y, Generation Y. The younger generation is so much better at asking questions than previous generations, and I really think this should be viewed as a positive. I'm somebody that started my career at a time when I would never be seen to be asking questions, and I'd find out a way to get to the knowledge in a much more inconspicuous way, and that's not what we're seeing in this younger generation. We know that processes in clinical data science are far more likely to be adhered to if individuals understanding the reasoning behind them. So questioning should be viewed as a positive thing. And this last question is possibly the trickiest, but do we think, or do you think, the expectations of younger generations are unrealistic? Now, obviously, it's the job of a good line manager to manage expectations, and unrealistic expectations, they usually arise when insufficient information is being shared. If an individual's expectations maybe relate to the working environment, because going back to that, being envious of their courage and they're asking questions, they may be asking for things that that we all want, but it's just that they are actually courageous enough to ask. People of all generations may like to work more flexibly, and in order to retain talent, companies need to consider those needs. But if an individual's expectations relate to advancement, and we've attempted to manage these expectations through our staples of line management skills, which I'll come on to in a bit, we may just need to accept the possibility that some individuals just do not yet have sufficient life experience to understand realistic expectations, and they will move on nonetheless. So this is not an issue that I think solely exists for Generation Y, it's just always existed. So I think that asking these questions may highlight that in some line managers there is some self-confidence issues, and that these need to be addressed. Just as our line reports have training requirements, as line managers we need to work to identify and address our own training needs. So if as line managers we do want to establish successful relationships, which of course we do, and we want to do this no matter which generation our line reports are from, what can we do? So I think a couple of decades ago people would start a job and would consider it perfectly normal to be intimidated by their line manager. And I honestly can say I have no idea in what way this contributed to staff motivation or low attrition or innovation. It's still a bit of a mystery to me, but we are living in enlightened times, so employers are far more aware of the real cost of staff turnover and the benefit to process improvements and efficiency by creating an environment where ideas can grow and flourish and where there are successful line management relationships. So I think in order to achieve this, it is necessary to create conditions where every voice can be heard. It is important that line managers have honest conversations with their line reports so that they are able to address their professional development needs properly. And the bedrock of line management is good communication, active listening and empathy, with that objective to build trust. And when it comes to performance management, honest communication is absolutely key, as people can't address their areas for improvement without knowing what they are. Line managers need to be practiced in the art of difficult conversations so that line reports don't become demotivated and can come away from constructive criticism feeling inspired with a drive to make changes. And I think as a line manager, this can be one of the most difficult skills to master. And of course, data scientists, clinical data scientists, they're not always the most extroverted individuals and often have quite a logical approach to many things, including their performance management. So it might require additional effort by a line manager to create an environment that the line report feels comfortable communicating honestly about when things are going well and when things are not going so well, so that they feel comfortable asking for help or being able to identify when they require additional support or training. So as a line manager, I've read the odd management book, and I've sort of come to the conclusion, or certainly of the opinion, that hitching my wagon to one method really isn't the way forward. So I sort of have a mix and match approach to the tips I pick up. But one of the methods that I found quite helpful is situational leadership, because it offers ideas that can help with development and it empowers line reports to be proactive in their own development. And if you are line managing an individual who's really pushing to take on more responsibly, possibly more than you think than they're ready for, then using the tools that's offered by something like situational leadership can help line managers and line reports identify those knowledge gaps, plan the level of support they may require to undertake new tasks. So we want to support our line reports in their development, and we don't want them to fail in the new tasks. So we need to develop methods of supporting people that work for everyone. Really, there's too much detail about situational leadership to go into. Here it would be a completely separate training session. But the important point is that the situational leadership is a good example of guidance that focuses on the individual rather than grouping people together, and includes developing the relationship between the individual and their colleagues. So In conclusion, there is a lot of material out there that directs us towards understanding the difference between generations. And as a way of understanding a whole population, it can be useful, but its impact on our understanding of our clinical data science line reports is really quite minimal, and we should be careful when attaching labels to individuals based on when they were born. In addition, as we become more and more connected to our global teams, the generational stereotypes become even less relevant. We should instead focus on the individual needs of our line reports by utilising those line management staples and creating an environment that is safe and equal. Clinical data scientists exhibit behaviours such as natural curiosity, tenacity to get to the solution of a problem, passion for healthcare and helping patients, and many self-starter qualities, none of which are dependent on which generation they belong to. So ignore the stereotypes, embrace the individuality of team members, as together they are capable of supporting drug development and achieving great results. So thank you very much. That's the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for listening to me this afternoon. I believe we now have some time for some questions.
Thanks, Diana. That was really helpful. So we've got one question that's come in. Just to recap, if you did want to ask Diana a question, you can do so by typing that into your questions box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. So we've just had one question come in throughout the session. This person said if they have got a new line report and they're really pushing to get ahead in their career, what should they do? How should they handle that?
So yeah, so as I mentioned, I think you go back to those staples. You know, it's all about listening to them and obviously communicating with them. But it is also moving. I mean, I suppose it's understanding where their knowledge is at right now and what knowledge and support they require to go to push forward. So if they're, in this particular environment, let's say they want to lead a study and they're a programmer and they want to be a lead programmer and they keep saying to the line report, I want to lead something, I want to lead something. So it's really about together with the line report assessing what skills they require to do the lead job successfully and whether they are actually displaying those behaviours right now. And if they're not, what do they need that helps them get to the point where they are displaying those behaviours, and having a plan for the support that they would require, either to have training in advance of doing the task and coaching while they're doing the task to really ensure that they don't fail just by being chucked in at the deep end and left alone. That's not the way to go. It is about coming up with a plan. So we hear quite a lot about the younger generation might be pushing ahead to do these things, but I personally haven't noticed any difference between now and 20 years ago. That is my recommendation, is that you need to make a plan of how to support them and have a plan of the level of development, you know, what the support that you're going to provide them as they go through the task in hand.
Very interesting, Fab. Thank you, Diana. So we haven't had any further questions come in whilst you've been talking. So if you did have any other questions that you wanted to ask Diana on this subject, if you reply to the email that you'll be receiving after the webinar, we can pass those on to her. So we'll be uploading the recording onto our YouTube channel and distributing the slides shortly. And I think that is everything. So I will leave you to have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you. Thanks, Diana.
Thank you very much.